time to wake up is now. So many have been trying to get to the truth. Out to you groups like Anonymous, 911truth.org, and wearechange.org, and Infowars.com. And now you are here at another radio that's the Minutemen Radio with the Mark Flood broadcast, a place where truth and freedom ring.
Fellow American patriots, I come to you today to let you know that your government cannot overpower you, and that you as the people hold your own fate and your way of life in the palm of your hands. You are under the watchful eye of an ever-increasingly tyrannical government, but within that government lies patriots just like you. For fear of retaliation from that very government and the safety of my family, I'm forced to cover my face like a common criminal, like a coward. I've been told that my thoughts are traitorous and that my actions un-American. Why? Because I support the people? Because I support the Constitution? I'm here today to say to those of you that are asleep that you are the traitor. You that stand idly by as our freedoms are slowly stripped from us are the un-American. I ask civilians on the street if they're aware of the form of government that this United States was founded on. Almost every one of them proudly stated democracy. Why, we spread democracy across the world, I've heard. Let me read to you Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution of the United States of America. The United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government, and it shall protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the legislature or of the executive when legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence. Tell me if this one sounds familiar. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. How did we get so far from our roots? And while I'm on pledges, many of you might have seen the YouTube video produced by Harpo Productions, where dozens of celebrities pledged to be a servant to our president and mankind. A servant to our president. Last time I checked, our president is a servant to the people. And I pledge no allegiance to any man. You know what I pledge? I pledge that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, both foreign and domestic, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, so help me God. That's what I pledge. And that's the pledge that every U.S. service member makes. Yet it seems most of them don't even know what's in the Constitution. Second Amendment, written December 15, 1791. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Shall not be infringed. I consider any laws that affect my right to keep and bear arms as an infringement on that right. So you lawmakers out there, go ahead. Push past the Blair Holtz H.R. 45 bill. We will use every avenue of peaceful resolve that we have. But you push our backs against the wall, and we will push back. Next is the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or the people. So all these laws that the government passes, like you having to give your child shot known to cause autism before your child can attend public school, the restrictions of homeschooling, the banning of medicines that help people, gun control being referred to the committee right now as I speak, the suspension of habeas corpus, so many unconstitutional notice and demand to the federal government as our agents to cease and desist effective immediately mandates that are beyond the scope of these constitutionally delegated powers. That's passion, conviction, dedication of the Oklahoma residents. And they're not alone. We, the American patriots, are tired of standing idly by. This is a call to arms. Support the sovereignty of your states. Reclaim your freedoms. Write your senators. Write your congressmen. Write your state representatives. For you American citizens that are asleep, there's something going on around you. And if you can't see it, it's only because you're so self-absorbed in your trinkets and your cell phones and your video games, your corporate jobs. There's a revolution brewing under the surface of your country and you don't even know it. If I ask you if you're awake and you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to start searching for information. You need to read your Constitution. You need to know your rights. Look up what started the first revolution. Do research on your monetary system. Keyword the Federal Reserve. Ask yourself a simple question. Do I want to be free? Or do I just ask for a protective master to watch over me? Time for you to make that choice is at hand. The enemies of the Constitution are not far away in some distant desert. They're found right here on our own soil. We have become complacent. We've allowed the tyrants to take over this country, and we have no one to blame but ourselves. The time is now. We must rise up together as one voice and resist while we still have the ability to resist. I know many of you are afraid of the government. You wonder how can you fight something as strong as the U.S. military. I ask you this question. Who is it that's behind those rifles that you fear? They are your sons, your daughters, your mothers, and your fathers. They are American citizens just like you. And let me assure you that there is a resistance within the military. We will not be silent. We will not obey. We will not allow the American people to be harmed and their rights to be taken away in any manner. We will not disarm the American people during martial law. Let me assure you, patriots, that we will die fighting our brothers in arms if we must, but we will not fight our countrymen. Our lives we stake on this. Patriots, the time is at hand. If the government pushes us into a corner, then I wish you well. For the fight that lies before us will be the toughest thing our generations have ever endured. Your grandchildren's grandchildren will read about how you fought for their freedoms. We can only hope that they will not be as foolish as we in allowing the government to ever do this again. Patriots, I'll leave you with the saying that my father left me with the day that I left the Marine Corps. Keep your chins up, your heads down, and dig your foxholes deep. Godspeed, and Semper Fidelis.
In the past, politicians promised to create a better world. They had different ways of achieving this, but their power and authority came from the optimistic visions they offered their people. Those dreams failed, and today people have lost faith in ideologies. Increasingly, politicians are seen simply as managers of public life. But now, they have discovered a new role that restores their power and authority. Instead of delivering dreams, politicians now promise to protect us from nightmares. They say that they will rescue us from dreadful dangers that we cannot see and do not understand. And the greatest danger of all is international terrorism, a powerful and sinister network with sleeper cells in countries across the world. A threat that needs to be fought by a war on terror. But much of this threat is a fantasy which has been exaggerated and distorted by politicians. It's a dark illusion that has spread unquestioned through governments around the world, the security services, and the international media. This is a series of films about how and why that fantasy was created and who it benefits. At the heart of the story are two groups: the American neoconservatives and the radical Islamists. Last week's episode ended in the late 90s, with both groups marginalised and out of power. But with the attacks on September the 11th, the fates of both dramatically changed. The Islamists, after their moment of triumph, were virtually destroyed within months, while the neoconservatives took power in Washington. But then, the neoconservatives began to reconstruct the Islamists. They created a phantom enemy. And as this nightmare fantasy began to spread, politicians realized the new power it gave them in a deeply disillusioned age. Those with the darkest nightmares became the most powerful. At the end of the 1990s, Osama bin Laden had returned to Afghanistan. He was accompanied by Ayman Zawahiri, the most influential ideologist of the Islamist movement. For 20 years, Zawahiri had struggled to create revolutions in the Arab world, but all attempts had ended in bloody failure.
Information about your whereabouts for some time. Where were you?
I was just roaming about.
In Afghanistan? Somewhere else?
Everywhere. I'm a Muslim. Being a Muslim, you are wanted everywhere. Because if you say no to the superpowers, this means in itself it's a crime. You are wanted for.
But it is easy for you to move around.
It's the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is greater than a superpower.
Zawahiri was a follower of the Egyptian revolutionary Said Qutb, who had been executed in 1966. Qutb's vision had been of a new type of modern state. It would contain all the benefits of Western science and technology, but it would use Islam as a moral framework to protect people from the culture of Western liberalism. Qutb believed that this culture infected the minds of Muslims, turning them into selfish creatures who threatened to destroy the shared values that held society together. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Zawahiri had tried to persuade the masses to rise up and topple the rulers who had allowed this corruption to infect their countries.
Now, we want to speak to the whole world. Who are we?
But the revolutionaries became trapped in a horrific escalation of violence because the masses refused to follow them. Islamism failed as a mass movement, and Zawahiri now came to the conclusion that a new strategy was needed.
They had no revolution at all. I mean, they had failed in their takeover. They had failed to topple the powers that be. And, they became more and more interested in this idea that only a small vanguard could be successful. I mean, they had lost confidence in the spontaneous capacity of the masses to be mobilized. Then they decided to change strategy completely. And instead of striking at what they called the near enemy, i.e. the local regimes, they decided that they could strike at the faraway enemy, i.e. at the West, at America. And that would impress the masses, and the masses would be mobilized.
Zawahiri and bin Laden began implementing this new strategy in August 1998. 2 huge suicide bombs were detonated outside American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing more than 200 people. The bombings had a dramatic effect on the West. For the first time, the name bin Laden entered the public consciousness as a terrorist mastermind. The suicide bombers had been recruited by bin Laden from the Islamist training camps in Afghanistan. But his and Zawahiri's operation was very much on the fringes of the Islamist movement. The overwhelming majority of the fighters in these camps had nothing at all to do with bin Laden or international terrorism. They were training to fight the regimes in their own countries, such as Uzbekistan, Kashmir and Chechnya. Their aim was to establish Islamist societies in the Muslim world, and they had no interest in attacking America. Bin Laden helped fund some of the camps, and in return was allowed to look for volunteers for his operations. But a number of senior Islamists were against his new strategy, including members of Zawahiri's own group, Islamic Jihad. Even bin Laden's displays of strength for the Western media were faked. The fighters in this video had been hired for the day and told to bring their own weapons. For beyond his own small group, bin Laden had no formal organization, until the Americans invented one for him. In January 2001, a trial began in a Manhattan courtroom of 4 men accused of the embassy bombings in East Africa. But the Americans had also decided to prosecute bin Laden in his absence. But to do this under American law, the prosecutors needed evidence of a criminal organization, because as with the mafia, that would allow them to prosecute the head of the organization, even if he could not be linked directly to the crime. And the evidence for that organization was provided for them by an ex-associate of bin Laden's called Jamal al-Fadl.
During the investigation of the 1998 bombings, there is a walk-in source, Jamal al-Fadl, who's a Sudanese militant who was with bin Laden in the early 90s, who has been passed around a whole series of Middle Eastern secret services, none of whom want much to do with him, who ends up in America and is taken on by the American government effectively as a key prosecution witness, and given a huge amount of American taxpayers' money at the same time. His account is used as raw material to build up a picture of Al-Qaeda. The picture that the FBI want to build up is one that will fit the existing laws that they will have to use to prosecute those responsible for the bombing. Now, those laws were drawn up to counteract organised crime, the mafia, drugs crime, crimes where people being a member of an organisation is extremely important. You have to have an organisation to get a prosecution. And you have al-Fadl and a number of other witnesses, a number of other sources who are happy to feed into this, who've got material that looked at in a certain way can be seen to show this organisation's existence. You put the two together and you get what is the first bin Laden myth, the first Al-Qaeda myth, and because it's one of the first, it's extremely influential.
The picture al-Fadl drew for the Americans of bin Laden was of an all-powerful figure at the head of a large terrorist network that had an organised hierarchy of control. He also said that bin Laden had given this network a name, Al-Qaeda. It was a dramatic and powerful picture of bin Laden, but it bore little relationship to the truth. The reality was that bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri had become the focus of a loose association of disillusioned Islamist militants who were attracted by the new strategy. But there was no organisation. These were militants who mostly planned their own operations and looked to bin Laden for funding and assistance. He was not their commander. There is also no evidence that bin Laden used the term Al-Qaeda to refer to the name of a group until after September the 11th, when he realised that this was the term the Americans had given him. In reality, Jamal al-Fadl was on the run from bin Laden, having stolen money from him. In return for his evidence, the Americans gave him witness protection in America and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Many lawyers at the trial believed that al-Fadl exaggerated and lied to give the Americans the picture of a terrorist organization that they needed to prosecute bin Laden.
And there were selective portions of al-Fadl's testimony that I believe was false to help support the picture that he helped the Americans join together. I think he lied in a number of specific testimony about a unified image of what this organization was. It made Al-Qaeda the new mafia or the new communists. It made them identifiable as a group, and therefore made it easier to prosecute any person associated with Al-Qaeda for any acts or statements made by bin Laden, who talked a lot.
The idea, which is critical to the FBI's prosecution, that bin Laden ran a coherent organization with operatives and cells all around the world, of which you could be a member, is a myth. There is no Al-Qaeda organization. There is no international network with a leader, with cadres who will unquestioningly obey orders, with tentacles that stretch out to sleeper cells in America, in Africa, in Europe. That idea of a coherent, structured terrorist network with an organized capability simply does not exist.
What did exist was a powerful idea that was about to inspire a single, devastating act that would lead the whole world into believing the myth that had begun to be constructed in the Manhattan courtroom.
What's this other jet doing? What's this other jet doing? Holy fuck!
Oh my God! Oh my God! Jesus fucking Christ!
Don't touch it.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh no!
Oh my God!
The attack on America by 19 hijackers shocked the world. It was Ayman Zawahiri's new strategy, implemented in a brutal and spectacular way. But neither he nor bin Laden were the originators of what was called the Plains Operation. It was the brainchild of an Islamist militant called Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who came to bin Laden for funding and help in finding volunteers. But in the wake of the panic created by the attacks, the politicians reached for the model which had been created by the trial earlier that year. The hijackers were just the tip of a vast international terrorist network which was called Al-Qaeda.
Al-Qaeda is to terror what the Mafia is to crime. There are thousands of these terrorists in more than 60 countries. They are recruited from their own nations and neighborhoods and brought to camps in places like Afghanistan, where they are trained in the tactics of terror.
This one network, Al-Qaeda, that's receiving so much discussion and publicity, may have activities in 50 to 60 countries, including the United States.
Our war is against networks and groups, people who coddle them, people who try to hide them, people who fund them. This is our calling.
And the attacks had another dramatic effect. They brought the neoconservatives back to power in America. When George Bush first became president, he had appointed neoconservatives like Paul Wolfowitz and their allies like Donald Rumsfeld to his administration. But their grand vision of America's role in the world was largely ignored by this new regime.
I just don't think it's the role of the United States to walk into a country and say, we do it this way, so should you. We're going to find those those evildoers.
But now the neoconservatives became all-powerful, because this terror network proved that what they had been predicting throughout the 1990s was correct. That America was at risk from terrifying new forces in a hostile world. A small group formed that began to shape America's response to the attacks. At its heart were Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, along with the Vice President, Dick Cheney, and Richard Pearl, who was a senior advisor to the Pentagon. The last time these men had been in power together was 20 years before, under President Reagan. Back then, they had taken on, and as they saw it, defeated a source of evil that wanted to take over America, the Soviet Union. And now they saw this new war on terror in the same epic terms.
The struggle against Soviet totalitarianism was a struggle between fundamental value questions. Good and evil is about as effective a shorthand as I can imagine in this regard. And there's something rather similar going on in the war on terror. It isn't a war on terror, it's a war on terrorists who wanted to impose an intolerant tyranny on all mankind. An Islamic universe in which we are all compelled to accept their beliefs and live by their lights. And in that sense, this is a battle between good and evil.
But as previous episodes have shown, the neoconservatives distorted and exaggerated the Soviet threat. They created the image of a hidden international web of evil run from Moscow that planned to dominate the world, when in reality the Soviet Union was on its last legs, collapsing from within. Now they did the same with the Islamists. They took a failing movement that had lost mass support and began to reconstruct it into the image of a powerful network of evil controlled from the center by bin Laden in his lair in Afghanistan. They did this because it fitted with their vision of America's unique destiny, to fight an epic battle against the forces of evil throughout the world.
What the neoconservatives are doing is taking a concept that they developed during the competition with the Soviet Union, i.e. Soviet communism was evil. They wanted to take over our country, wanted to take over our people, our classrooms, our society. It was that kind of concept of evil that they took, an exaggerated one to be sure, and then apply it to a new threat where it didn't apply at all, and yet it was layered with the same kind of cultural baggage. The policy says there's a network. The policy says that network is evil. They want to infiltrate our classrooms. They want to take our society. They want all our women to wear, veils. And this is what we have to deal with. And therefore, since we know it's evil, let's just kill it. And that will make it go away.
And so the Americans set off to invade Afghanistan to find and destroy the heart of this network. To do this, the Americans allied themselves with a group called the Northern Alliance. They were a loose collection of warlords fighting a war of resistance against the Taliban, the Islamists who controlled Afghanistan. The Taliban's best troops were the thousands of foreign fighters from the training camps, who the Northern Alliance hated.
Pakistan.
And now they took their revenge on the foreign fighters. The Americans believed that these men were Al-Qaeda terrorists, and the Northern Alliance did nothing to disabuse them of this, because they were paid by the Americans for each prisoner they delivered. But the majority of these fighters had never had anything to do with bin Laden or international terrorism. Both they and the Taliban were radical nationalists who wanted to create Islamist societies in their own countries. But now they were either killed or taken off to Guantanamo Bay. And Islamism, as an organized movement for changing the Muslim world, was obliterated in Afghanistan. But as it disappeared, it was replaced by ever more extravagant fantasies about the power and reach of the Al-Qaeda network. In December, the Northern Alliance told the Americans that bin Laden was hiding in the mountains of Tora Bora. They were convinced they had found the heart of his organization.
The search for Osama bin Laden, there was constant discussion about him hiding out in caves, and I think many times the American people have a perception that it's a little hole dug out of a side of a mountain.
Oh, no.
This is it. This is a fortress.
Yes.
A complex, multi-tiered, bedrooms and offices on the top, as you can see. Secret exits on the side and on the bottom. Cut deep to avoid thermal detection. A ventilation system to allow people to breathe and to carry on. The entrance is large enough to drive trucks and even tanks. Even computer systems and telephone systems. It's a very sophisticated operation.
Oh, you bet. This is serious business. And there's not one of those. There are many of those.
For days, the Americans bombed the mountains at Tora Bora with the most powerful weapons they had. The Northern Alliance had been paid more than $1 million for their help and information. And now their fighters set off up the mountains to storm bin Laden's fortress and bring back the Al-Qaeda terrorists and their leader. But all they found were a few small caves, which were either empty or had been used to store ammunition. There was no underground bunker system, no secret tunnels. The fortress didn't exist. The Northern Alliance did produce some prisoners they claimed were Al-Qaeda fighters, but there was no proof of this. And one rumour was that the Northern Alliance was simply kidnapping anyone who looked remotely like an Arab and selling them to the Americans for yet more money. The Americans now began to search all the caves in all the mountains of eastern Afghanistan for the hidden Al-Qaeda network.
We found a cave. The rest of it is open, break.
If nobody went up to look into that cave, people could have been hiding up there for days and watching everything that we did.
But wherever they looked, there was nothing there. Al-Qaeda seemed to have completely disappeared. But then, the British arrived to help. They were convinced they could hunt down Al-Qaeda because of what they said was their unique experience in fighting terrorism in Northern Ireland. They could succeed where others had failed.
The hunt for Al-Qaeda and Taliban goes on. And we stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States and our other coalition allies in the global war of terrorism.
But how many Al-Qaeda have you captured?
We haven't captured any Al-Qaeda, but...
And how many have you actually managed to kill here in southeast Afghanistan?
We haven't killed any.
The terrible truth was that there was nothing there because Al-Qaeda as an organization did not exist. The attacks on America had been planned by a small group that had come together around bin Laden in the late 90s. What had united them was an idea, an extreme interpretation of Islamism developed by Ayman Zawahiri. With the American invasion, that group had been destroyed, killed or scattered. What was left was the idea. And the real danger was the way this idea could inspire groups and individuals around the world who had no relationship to each other. In looking for an organization, the Americans and the British were chasing a phantom enemy and missing the real threat.
I was with the Royal Marines as they trooped around eastern Afghanistan. And every time they got a location for a supposed Al-Qaeda or Taliban element or base, they'd turn up and there was no one there, or there'd be a few startled shepherds. And that struck me then as being a wonderful image for the war on terror, because people are looking for something that isn't there. There is no organisation with its terrorist operatives, cells, sleeper cells, so on and so forth. What there is an idea prevalent among young, angry Muslim males throughout the Islamic world. That idea is what poses a threat.
But the neoconservatives were now increasingly locked into this fantasy. And next, they set out to uncover the network in America itself.
This is a network that has penetrated into some 60 countries, including very definitely our own, and it's got to be rooted out. Our intelligence priority in many ways is getting after the network here in the United States first. We will do whatever we need to do to go after these networks and dismantle them.
The American government set out to search for the Al-Qaeda organization inside its own country. Thousands were detained as all branches of the law and the military were told to look for terrorists.
You don't really know what a terrorist looks like, what kind of car they drive, or anything else. So it's just basically everything and everybody and anything out here.
And bit by bit, the government found the network, a series of hidden cells in cities across the country, from Buffalo to Portland.
We've thwarted terrorists in Buffalo and Seattle, Portland, Detroit, North Carolina, and Tampa, Florida. We're determined to stop the enemy before he can strike our people.
The Americans called them sleeper cells and asserted that they had just been waiting to strike. But in reality, there is very little evidence that any of those arrested had anything at all to do with terrorist plots. From Portland to the suburb of Buffalo called Lackawanna, yet again the Americans were chasing a phantom enemy.
They say terrorist sleeper cell. That's what they call the Lackawanna people a terrorist sleeper cell, the Detroit people a terrorist cell, the Portland people a terrorist cell. But when you look at the details, the facts just don't support that. And they have not proved that any group within the United States has plotted to engage in any terrorist activity within the United States in all of the cases that they've brought since 9/11.
The evidence behind all of the sleeper cell cases is flimsy and often bizarre. This tape was one of the central pieces of evidence in the first of the cases. It was found in a raid on this house in Detroit. 4 Arab men were arrested on suspicion of being an Al-Qaeda sleeper cell. They had been accused by another immigrant called Mr. Mimza. But Mr. Mimza was in reality an international con man, with 12 aliases and wanted for fraud across America. Despite this, the FBI offered to reduce his sentence for fraud if he testified against the men. And to back up Mr. Mimza's allegations, the FBI turned to the videotape. On the surface, it was the innocent record of a trip to Disneyland by a group of teenagers who had nothing to do with the accused. But the government had discovered a hidden and sinister purpose to the tape.
The government expert who has looked into surveillance tapes, casing tapes as he referred to them, said that one of the objectives of making these kinds of tapes is to disguise the nature, the real purpose of the tape. And he explained that the tape is made to look benign, made to look like a tourist tape, to obscure its real purpose as a tape to case Disneyland, and that the very appearance of it as being just a tourist tape is actually evidence that it's not a tourist tape.
أبو ظبي الجزيرة هوليوود لوس أنجلوس كاليفورنيا. Hello.
I could never get past the fact that the tape just looked like a tourist tape. The Disneyland ride, for example, was a lengthy queue, people just making their way to the ride. The camera occasionally pans to look at the rocks on the wall, made to look like an Indiana Jones movie, and after several minutes, the camera, it pans across and shows a trash can momentarily, and then continues off to look into the crowd. The expert basically said that by flashing on that trash can for a moment, the people who are part of this conspiracy to conduct these kinds of terrorist operations, they would understand what this is all about, how to locate a bomb at Disneyland in California. All the talking and banter were intended to disguise the hidden message contained within the tape.
The government was convinced that the tape was full of hidden messages. A brief shot of a tree outside the group's hotel room was there, they said, to show where to place a sniper to attack the cars on the freeway. And what looked like a camera which had accidentally been left running was in reality a terrorist secretly counting out the distances to show others where to place a bomb. And the government also said that the Detroit cell was planning to attack US military bases around the world. And yet again, they found hidden evidence for this. In a day planner they discovered under the sofa in the house in Detroit. What looked like doodles were in reality, they said, a plan to attack a US base in Turkey.
The government brought in a security officer from the base to testify that she identified these as being AWACS airplanes and these as being fighter jets. She said that these solid lines were lines of fire. She also said that this down here was a hardened bunker.
But the drawings in the day planner were discovered to have actually been the work of a madman. They were the fantasies of a Yemeni who believed that he was the Minister of Defense for the whole of the Middle East. He had committed suicide a year before any of the accused had arrived in Detroit, leaving the day planner lying under the sofa in the house. Despite this, 2 of the accused were found guilty. But then, the government's only witness, Mr. Mimser, told 2 of his cellmates that he had made the whole thing up to get his fraud charges reduced. The terrorism convictions have now been overturned by the...
Want to know what's going on? Want to get the inside scoop? Minutemen Radio, the Mark Fluitt broadcast, will give you the stories that corporate media mongers will not tell you. Want the truth? Then go to fluittnews.webs.com. That's fluittnews.webs.com.
Despite this, 2 of the accused were found guilty. But then, the government's only witness, Mr. Mimser, told 2 of his cellmates that he had made the whole thing up to get his fraud charges reduced. The terrorism convictions have now been overturned by the judge in the case. But it was acclaimed by the President as the first success in the war on terror at home.
We have the terrorists on the run. We're keeping them on the run. One by one, the terrorists are learning the meaning of American justice.
Another case in the city of Buffalo in New York seemed on the surface to be more substantial. 6 young Yemeni Americans had gone to an Islamist training camp in Afghanistan. They travelled there in early 2001 and spent between 2 and 6 weeks training and being taught Islamist revolutionary theory. 2 of them even met bin Laden on one of his tours of the camp. They then returned to the Buffalo suburb of Lackawanna where they lived, but they did nothing. The FBI heard about their trip, and they watched the 6 men around the clock for nearly a year, but there was no suspicious behaviour. But then, one of the men, Mr. al-Bakri, went to Bahrain and sent his friends an email. It said he was going to get married and he wouldn't be seeing them for a while. The CIA, who had been monitoring their emails, understood this to be a coded message. The cell was about to launch a suicide attack on the US 5th Fleet.
The FBI, the government, took that phrase to mean something sinister. They believed that the word wedding was a code. They believed that the phrase not seeing you anymore indicated that Mukhtar al-Bakri was a suicide bomber. The reality is that Mr. al-Bakri was in Bahrain to get married. And the reality of him getting married is he wouldn't be around with his friends anymore.
Good afternoon. In the past 24 hours, United States law enforcement has identified and disrupted an al-Qaeda-trained terrorist cell on American soil.
The arrests were announced proudly by Washington as another sleeper cell plotting an attack. But it soon became clear that there was no evidence for this at all other than the email.
And the best the government can point to as a sleeper cell are these young men in Lackawanna, New York, who, yes, went to Afghanistan, trained in an al-Qaeda training camp, but from all appearances had no intention to ever take any action on the basis of that. One of them faked an injury to try to get out early. They came back to the United States. We had them under intensive surveillance, and we found no evidence, not one shred of evidence, that they ever planned or intended to engage in any kind of criminal, much less terrorist act. That's the best they can show for a sleeper cell.
Faced with the fact that there was no evidence, the government quietly dropped any charges of there being a terrorist cell. Instead, they were prosecuted simply for having gone to the training camp and for having bought uniforms there. and all the other cases were even flimsier. A group of students who supported the liberation of Kashmir were found paintballing in the woods of Virginia. They were convicted of training to attack America. A group of African Americans from Oregon tried to go to Afghanistan to support the Taliban, but got lost in China. All these groups, the government said, were part of a hidden and terrifying Al-Qaeda network.
The government had a legitimate concern at the beginning, but they let that concern and they took it and they made it a panic. They had reasonable questions and took them and made a complete fantasy out of them. They started out with a conclusion and then filled in all the blanks to the questions. So this was totally driven by the need or the desire to have terrorists. You build this conclusion based on this assumption and this assumption and this assumption. And sure, if you build assumptions upon assumptions, you can go anywhere.
It's a work of imagination.
It is. It's a fantasy. And it's a fantasy that it was politically expedient to sell.
And make no mistake about it, we got a war here just like we got a war abroad.
In Britain too, the government and most of the media have created an overwhelming impression that there is a hidden network of Al-Qaeda sleeper cells waiting to attack.
Ask you to move back, please.
But yet again, there is very little evidence for this. Of the 664 people arrested under the Terrorism Act since September the 11th, none of them have been convicted of belonging to Al-Qaeda. Only 3 people have so far been convicted of having any association with any Islamist groups. And none of those convictions were for being involved with a terror plot. They were for fundraising or possessing Islamist literature. The majority of people convicted under the Terrorism Act since September the 11th have actually been members of Irish terrorist groups, like the UVF or the Real IRA. And many of the arrests that were dramatically announced as being part of a hidden Al-Qaeda network were in reality as absurd as the cases in America. For example, the London police swooped on a Mr. Zainul Abidin, who they said was running an international network for terrorist training. It turned out to be a self-defense course for bodyguards he called Ultimate Jihad Challenge. His only client was a security guard from a supermarket who wanted to learn how to defend himself against shoplifters. Mr. Zainul Abidin was cleared of all charges. Then there was the Hogmanay terror cell, who it was alleged were planning to attack Edinburgh. All charges against them were quietly dropped when it was revealed that a key part of the evidence, a map which showed the targets they were going to attack, turned out to have been left in their flat by an Australian backpacker who had ringed the tourist sites he wanted to see. And even the most frightening and high profile of the plots uncovered turned out to be without foundation. No one was ever arrested for planning gas attacks on the London tubes. It was a fantasy that swept through the media. Just as in America, there is no evidence yet of the powerful and organised network lurking under the surface of our society that the government says threatens the life of the nation.
So there was no network?
No.
No.
Probably not.
We invented it.
Invention's too strong a term. I think we projected it. We projected our own worst fears, and that what we see is a fantasy that's being created.
Al-Qaeda is a global network with global reach.
To target a deadly web of terror.
I'm not saying that an atrocity might not happen on the British mainland. But what I am saying is that we have an exaggerated perception of the possibility of terrorism that is quite disabling. And we only need to look at the evidence to understand that the figures simply don't bear out the way that we have responded as a society.
What the British and American governments have done is both distort and exaggerate the real nature of the threat. There are dangerous and fanatical groups around the world who have been inspired by the extreme Islamist theories, and they are prepared to use the techniques of mass terror on civilians. The bombings in Madrid show this only too clearly. But this is not a new phenomenon. What is new is the way the American and other governments have transformed this complex and disparate threat into a simplistic fantasy of an organized web of uniquely powerful terrorists who may strike anywhere and at any moment. But no one questioned this fantasy, because increasingly it was serving the interests of so many people.
Open, O sesame!
For the press, television, and hundreds of terror experts, the fact that it seemed so like fiction made it irresistible to their audiences. And the Islamists, too, began to realize that by feeding this media fantasy, they could become a powerful organization again, if only in people's imaginations. The prime mover in this was one of bin Laden's associates, who had been captured by the Americans. He was called Abu Zubaydah. He began to tell his interrogators of terrifying plots that Al-Qaeda was preparing, some of which, he said, they had copied from Hollywood movies, like Godzilla, which they had watched in Afghanistan.
Zubaydah told the interrogators a set of stories based on what he thought would alarm us. He told us, for example, coming out of a movie that had been recent at that time, Godzilla, in which the Brooklyn Bridge was destroyed by the monster. He told us that Al-Qaeda was interested in destroying the Brooklyn Bridge. He told us of attacks on mass transit sources like subway trains. He told us there were intentions of attacking apartment buildings and shopping centers, the Statue of Liberty, all manner of things.
Recent intelligence reports suggest that Al-Qaeda leaders have emphasized planning for attacks on apartment buildings, hotels, and other soft or lightly secured targets in the United States. Terrorists are considering physical attacks against U.S. financial institutions.
And Abu Zubaydah also told his interrogators of a terrifying new weapon the Islamists intended to use, an explosive device that could spray radiation through cities, the dirty bomb.
First, a CBS News exclusive about a captured Al-Qaeda leader who says his fellow terrorists have the know-how to build a very dangerous weapon and get it to the United States.
And the media took the bait. They portrayed the dirty bomb as an extraordinary weapon that would kill thousands of people. And in the process, they made the hidden enemy even more terrifying. But in reality, the threat of a dirty bomb is yet another illusion. Its aim is to spread radioactive material through a conventional explosion. But almost all studies of such a possible weapon have concluded that the radiation spread in this way would not kill anybody, because the radioactive material would be so dispersed. And providing the area was cleaned promptly, the long-term effects would be negligible. In the past, both the American army and the Iraqi military tested such devices, and both concluded that they were completely ineffectual weapons for this very reason.
How dangerous would a dirty bomb be?
The deaths would be few, if any. And the answer is probably none.
Really?
Yes. And that's been said over and over again, but then people immediately say after that, but, you know, people won't believe that and they'll panic. And then all the people working on this project, you know, the defense and so forth, they'll breathe a big sigh of relief because they got their problem back. You know, we're going to all panic. I don't think it would kill anybody, and I think you'll have trouble finding a serious report that would claim otherwise. The Department of Energy actually set up such a test, and they actually measured what happened. And the measurements were extremely low. They calculated that the most exposed individual would get a fairly high dose, not life-threatening, but fairly high. And I checked into how the calculation was done, and they assumed that after the attack, no one moves for 1 year. 1 year. Now that's ridiculous.
The dirty bomb, the danger from radioactivity is basically next to nothing. The danger from panic, however, is horrendous. That's where the irony comes, is instead of the government saying, look, this is not a serious weapon, the serious danger of this is the panic that would ensue, and there is no reason for panic. Don't panic.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the end of our show. However, something very much like this could happen at any moment. We just thought we ought to prepare you and more or less put you in the mood. Thank you. And now back to our story.
The scale of this fantasy just kept growing as more and more groups realized the power it gave them. Above all, the group who had been instrumental in first spreading the idea, the neoconservatives. Because they now found they could use it to help them realize their vision, that America had a special destiny to overcome evil in the world. And this epic mission would give meaning and purpose to the American people. To do this, they were going to start with Iraq. And just as they had discovered a hidden reality of terror beneath the surface in America, they now found hidden links that previously no one had suspected between the Al-Qaeda network and Saddam Hussein.
Evidence from intelligence sources, secret communications, and statements by people now in custody reveal that Saddam Hussein aids and protects terrorists, including members of Al-Qaeda. Imagine those 19 hijackers with other weapons and other plans, this time armed by Saddam Hussein.
I continue to be amazed at the people who say there are no links. It simply isn't true. What hasn't been established is a direct link between Saddam's intelligence and the 9/11 plotters, although even there is evidence that suggests very possibly facilitation and assistance to the 9/11 hijackers.
There really is evidence?
There really is evidence.
So when people say there is no association between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, they're wrong?
They're flatly wrong.
Really?
Absolutely wrong.
Okay, stand by. Okay.
The driving force behind these new global policies in the war on terror was the power of a dark fantasy. A sinister web of hidden and interlinked threats that stretched around the world. And such was the power of that fantasy that it also began to transform the very nature of politics. Because increasingly, politicians were discovering that their ability to imagine the future and the terrible dangers it held gave them a new and heroic role in the world. In the post-war years, politicians had also used their imaginations, but to project optimistic visions of a better future that they could create for their people. And it was these visions that gave them power and authority. But those dreams collapsed, and politicians like Tony Blair became more like managers of public life, their policies determined often by focus groups. But now, the war on terror allowed politicians like Blair to portray a new grand vision of the future. But this vision was a dark one of imagined threats, and a new force began to drive politics: the fear of an imagined future.
Not a conventional fear about a conventional threat, but the fear that one day these new threats of weapons of mass destruction, rogue states and international terrorism combine to deliver a catastrophe to our world. And then the shame of knowing that I saw that threat day after day and did nothing to stop it.
It may not erupt and engulf us this month or next. Perhaps not even this year or next.
I just think these dangers are there. I think that it's difficult sometimes for people to see how they all come together. I think it's my duty to tell it to you if I really believe it. And I do really believe it. I may be wrong in believing it, but I do believe it.
What Blair argued was that faced by the new threat of a global terror network, the politician's role was now to look into the future and imagine the worst that might happen, and then act ahead of time to prevent it. In doing this, Blair was embracing an idea that had actually been developed by the Green movement. It was called the precautionary principle. Back in the 1980s, thinkers within the ecology movement believed the world was being threatened by global warming. But at the time, there was little scientific evidence to prove this. So they put forward the radical idea that governments had a higher duty. They couldn't wait for the evidence because by then it would be too late. They had to act imaginatively, on intuition, in order to save the world from a looming catastrophe.
In essence, the precautionary principle says that not having the evidence that something might be a problem is not a reason for not taking action as if it were a problem. That's a very famous triple negative phrase that effectively says that action without evidence is justified. It requires imagining what the worst might be and applying that imagination upon the worst evidence that currently exists.
Would Al-Qaeda buy weapons of mass destruction if it could? Certainly. Does it have the financial resources? Probably. Would it use such weapons? Definitely.
But once you start imagining what could happen, then there's no limit. What if they had access to it? What if they could effectively deploy it? What if we weren't prepared? What it is a shift from the scientific what is evidence-based decision-making to this speculative, imaginary, what-if-based worst-case scenario.
And it was this principle that now began to shape government policy in the war on terror. In both America and Britain, individuals were detained in high-security prisons, not for any crimes they had committed, but because the politicians believed, or imagined, that they might commit an atrocity in the future, even though there was no evidence they intended to do this. The American Attorney General explained this shift to what he called the paradigm of prevention.
We had to make a shift in the way we thought about things. So being reactive, waiting for a crime to be committed, or waiting for there to be evidence of the commission of a crime didn't seem to us to be an appropriate way to protect the American people.
Under the preventive paradigm, instead of holding people accountable for what you can prove that they have done in the past, you lock them up based on what you think or speculate they might do in the future. And how can a person who's locked up based on what you think they might do in the future disprove your speculation? It's impossible. And so what ends up happening is the government short-circuits all the processes that are designed to distinguish the innocent from the guilty because they simply don't fit this mode of locking people up for what they might do in the future.
The supporters of the precautionary principle argue that this loss of rights is the price that society has to pay when faced by the unique and terrifying threat of the Al-Qaeda network. But as this series has shown, the idea of a hidden, organized web of terror is largely a fantasy. And by embracing the precautionary principle, the politicians have become trapped in a vicious circle. They imagine the worst about an organization that doesn't even exist. But no one questions this, because the very basis of the precautionary principle is to imagine the worst without supporting evidence. And instead, those with the darkest imaginations become the most influential.
You'll hear about meetings where terrorist matters are discussed in the intelligence community, and always the person with the most dire assessment, the person with who has the kind of strongest sense that something should be done, will frequently carry the day at meetings. We must believe the most dire estimate of what could happen now. The sense of disbelief has vanished.
So the person with the most vivid imagination becomes the most powerful?
In a sense, that's correct.
But now there are growing questions about the British government's precautionary measures, and about whether the threat is really as great as they claim. In December last year, the Law Lords ruled by a majority of 8-1 that the government's detention of foreign nationals without trial was illegal under the European Convention on Human Rights.
Senior judges ruled that foreign terrorist suspects cannot be locked up without trial in British jails.
And one Law Lord, Lord Hoffman, went further. he publicly challenged the very basis of the government's war on terror, that radical Islamism was a threat to the life of the nation. I do not underestimate, Lord Hoffman said, the ability of fanatical groups of terrorists to kill and destroy, but they do not threaten the life of the nation. Whether we would survive Hitler hung in the balance, but there is no doubt we shall survive Al-Qaeda. The Spanish people have not said that what happened in Madrid, hideous crime as it was, threatened the life of their nation. Terrorist violence, serious as it is, does not threaten our existence as a civil community.
You know, just it's the way we live today. We're living on a knife edge.
This story began over 30 years ago as the dream that politics could create a better world began to fall apart. Out of that collapse came two groups, the Islamists and the neoconservatives. Looking back, we can now see that these groups were the last political idealists, who in an age of growing disillusion tried to reassert the inspirational power of political visions that would give meaning to people's lives. But both have failed in their attempts to transform the world, and instead, together, they have created today's strange fantasy of fear, which politicians have seized on. Because in an age when all the grand ideas have lost credibility, fear of a phantom enemy is all the politicians have left to maintain their power.
And we have seen Americans in uniform storming mountain strongholds and charging through sandstorms. We have fought the terrorists across the earth because the lives of our citizens are at stake. And America and the world are safer.
In a society that believes in nothing, fear becomes the only agenda. Whilst the 20th century was dominated between a conflict between a free market right and a socialist left, even though both of those outlooks had their limitations and their problems, at least they believed in something. Whereas what we are seeing now is a society that believes in nothing. And a society that believes in nothing is particularly frightened by people who believe in anything. And therefore, we label those people as fundamentalists or fanatics, and they have much greater purchase in terms of the fear that they instill in society than they truly deserve. But that's a measure of how much we have become isolated and atomized, rather than of their inherent strength.
But the fear will not last. And just as the dreams that politicians once promised turned out to be illusions, so too will the nightmares. And then our politicians will have to face the fact that they have no visions, either good or bad, to offer us any longer.
Raindrops keep falling on my head, but that doesn't mean my eyes will soon be turning red. Crying's not for me, 'cause I'm never gonna stop the rain by complaining, because I'm free. Nothing's worrying me, 'cause I'm free. Nothing's worrying me.
Want to know what's going on? Want to get the inside scoop? Minutemen Radio, the Mark Fluid broadcast, will give you the stories that corporate media mongers will not tell you. Want the truth? Then go to fluidnews.webs.com. That's fluidnews.webs.com. Now you can get good quality made gifts from true veterans. No more will you have to keep shelling out your money to the fat corporate mongers that all they do is can keep you down. The globalists want you to spend all your hard-earned money, but why would you, when you can go to the top Patriot stores around, and one of them are effyshopworld.webs.com, a complete line of military local gifts designed by 100% American. Stop catering to the globalists, and stop catering to a crisis. Make a difference today. Go to effyshopworld.webs.com.
In the past, politicians promised to create a better world. They had different ways of achieving this, but their power and authority came from the optimistic visions they offered their people. Those dreams failed.
We're sitting down with Michael Scheuer, the man who had served in the CIA for more than 20 years, up until 2004. At one time, he was the chief of the CIA bin Laden unit. Then he went and exposed how counter-effective Washington's methods were in the fight against terror. He looked at the U.S. through its enemy's eyes. In fact, it's the title of one of his books called Through Our Enemy's Eyes. I'm very pleased to have the chance to interview you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Scheuer.
I'm glad to be here.
Bin Laden is gone. Who is Washington's #1 enemy now?
Washington's enemy is an enemy that doesn't exist. We're fighting an Islamic enemy that Washington believes is out to kill us because we have elections, because we're free, because we have women in the workplace. It's an enemy that doesn't exist. It didn't exist when bin Laden was alive. It doesn't exist now. America is being attacked because of its foreign policy in the Muslim world, because of its support for Israel, because of its support for the Saudi police state, because of its presence on the Arab Peninsula. And until we accept that, until Americans can say to each other, whether you support aid to Israel or not, our relationship with Israel is causing this war, we are not going to be able to defeat this enemy. And Israel itself as a country is not the problem. The real problem is the leaders of the Jewish American community in the United States who influence and corrupt our Congress to support Israel when we have no interest there.
You imply that the Israeli lobby is dragging the United States into the wars, into
Absolutely.
the conflicts?
They're absolutely dragging us in. Iraq was a war that was proffered or was called for mainly...
Then let me ask you this. Yeah. The situation in the region, in the wake of all these revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa,
yes.
You can pretty much describe it as turmoil. Turmoil is no good for Israel. Isn't there a contradiction to what you're saying?
Well, the American political establishment is caught between two things. They're extremely pro-Israel, and they're almost Marxist in their belief that democracy and the spread of democracy is inevitable in all places, in all peoples, at all times. And so they need to protect the Israelis, but they can't say what is a reality. For example, there is not going to be a democracy in Tunisia, or Libya or Egypt that in any way resembles democracy in the West. And yet what they've done is create anarchy. They've created a situation where the only beneficiaries are the Islamists. The guns that have flown out of Egypt, out of Tunisia, out of Libya to the Islamists have been enormous in their volume. And the prisons that were opened in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya have reinforced the Islamist groups across the world. So their mindless pursuit of secular democracy, at the end of the day, endangers the stability of the region and probably the whole world.
Are you saying we're going to see further radicalization of the region?
Oh, especially in Africa. Yes, ma'am. The guns that are flowing out of the 3 places where there were Arab Spring revolts are going to cause problems in Somalia, across North Africa, and in Nigeria.
Let's talk about Syria.
Yes.
Syria says the earth will start shaking if anyone intervenes in their internal affairs. How badly does the U.S. Is the U.S. trying to interfere?
Oh, I think we're interfering unconscionably. Until they removed the U.S. ambassador, he was running around the country trying to encourage groups to overthrow the Syrian government. That is not the role of any diplomat, United States or Russian or Chinese or British. We have really very cold-bloodedly urged Syrians to get out on the street knowing that they're going to get shot down by their government. Again, Syria is a country where there is no U.S. interest. Since I was a little boy, we've been afraid of the Syrians, and if you look at the map, it's hard to imagine that little blot of country called Syria could be a threat to the United States.
The CIA has reportedly worked with the Syrian opposition for years.
Well, I'm not sure we worked with the Syrian opposition. We've certainly worked with the Syrian
WikiLeaks
government.
Cables,
well, I haven't. Yeah. Well, then, if it's there, it's there. But our relationship with the Syrians is really a relatively unimportant one. But again, it's another very good example of the dichotomy in the thinking of American leaders. Because as we call for democracy in Syria, if Assad goes, Israel's security goes straight down.
If the region becomes a complete mess, doesn't Washington see any dangers to Israel? I mean, with Iran involved, it won't be pretty.
I think that's exactly right, ma'am. I don't know what the thinking is, except that they have come down on the belief that democracy is better for everybody. And the truth is, American and Western foreign policy interests in the Middle East have depended for 50 years on the maintenance of tyranny. Tyranny that gave us access to oil, tyranny that protected Israel, and in the last 20 years, tyrannies that persecuted Islamists to protect us. All of that is going by the wayside. And to the Israelis' credit, the Israelis are the only ones who have stood up and said, democracy may not be very good for our security, and they couldn't be more correct.
About Iran, what's Washington's plan for Iran?
Whatever Israel's plan is for Iran. Both parties, Republicans and Democrats, are deathly afraid that the Israelis will attack them off their own hook. And if Israel attacks Iran, the Americans will get blamed for condoning it, whether we did or not. So I think what we're seeing is a slow, almost inexorable advance toward some kind of a conflict with Iran.
What do you make of these recent accusations that the Iranian government was trying to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington?
I'm not in a position to know whether or not the information was accurate. But when I was a young intelligence officer, I worked against Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah. And I can tell you, in the 90s, they were meticulous in covering their tracks and only using as agents of terrorism their own people. The plot that was described by the Attorney General of the United States is a comic opera.
Through a Mexican drug cartel.
Yeah, and to believe that the Iranians would risk war with the United States, Israel, and much of NATO to kill a Saudi ambassador who was not even part of the royal family, that's hard for me to believe.
Let's talk about Libya. Libya is in ruins in the wake of NATO bombings. Yes. It's brimming with weapons.
Yes.
An al-Qaeda flag was planted over a courthouse in Benghazi.
Yes.
How good of a playground is Libya for people with radical agendas?
Very strong Islamist presence in Libya. Since the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan, Libya has sent as many of its people to fight in those insurgencies, the Islamist insurgencies, as any other country in North Africa, maybe outside of Saudi Arabia. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group fought a long time against the Soviets. They fought against Gaddafi. A great number of Libyans went to Iraq and to Afghanistan to fight us. And whatever strength the Libyan resistance had in terms of military capability, that came from experienced Islamist fighters. So the idea that somehow there's democracy afoot in Libya is just simply wrong.
Could it become a hotbed of terror?
I don't know if it could become a hotbed of terror, but it can become a country that's decidedly anti-American, anti-NATO. It can be probably less a hotbed of terror than a country that is vastly unstable.
It seems the U.S. is almost creating grounds for terrorists to surge and then goes out fighting them. We see it in Pakistan. They got the whole nation alienated because of the strikes. A lot of people want revenge. How efficient is that?
We are very efficient in this day and age, in the last 20 years, in creating enemies. We're not very efficient in creating security for the United States. We have the best educated population in the world, and we have the people with the littlest amount of common sense. How many times have we heard Mr. Clinton, Mr. Bush, Mr. Obama say, this has nothing to do with religion, this is not a religious war, this is a bunch of people who are just madmen. We are definitely fighting a religious war. And until we come to realize that, we are never going to be able to defeat it. In fact, we're encouraging the growth of a new generation of people who are going to fight us.
The U.S. is pulling its troops out of Iraq, but at the same time, it's boosting its military presence in the Persian Gulf. More ground troops are planned to be deployed. New drone bases are being built. What do you make of such expansion?
It just demonstrates again the ignorance of the United States government in terms of its political leadership about what our problem is in the Muslim world. The key point of formation for al-Qaeda was the presence of U.S. military forces on the Arabian Peninsula. 15 years after they declared war on us, we're now going to take people out of Iraq and put them in Kuwait and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, reinforcing our presence on the Arab Peninsula, only going to cause us more foes and more enemies in the Islamic world. It's a contradiction. It's a lack of common sense.
Let me ask you this: if the U.S. pulls out of everywhere,
yes,
is it going to be the end of terrorism?
It certainly would deny the terrorists the glue of unity that keeps them focused on the United States. If we weren't the main enemy, they would be attacking Israel, they would be attacking the Saudis, they would be attacking the Moroccans. The war would be
And would you say let them attack the Israelis and the Saudis?
Let them go. Sometimes they say the Chinese will come in. I said, let the Chinese deal with these people for the next 50 years. We've had enough of it. But I think the point is the Americans can't get out. We're dependent on the Saudis to maintain our interests in the world oil market. And the Saudis buy, next to the Chinese, more of our debt than anyone else. So as long as we're side by side with the Saudis and with the Israelis, we're stuck in the Middle East, and America will continue to bleed.
Dr. Schroyer, thanks for the interview.
Yes, ma'am.
Want to know what's going on? Want to get the inside scoop? Minutemen Radio, the Mark Fluid broadcast, will give you the stories that corporate media mongers will not tell you. Want the truth? Then go to fluidnews.webs.com. That's fluidnews.webs.com.
Some are just recounting what went on in that school. Joining me is the Wasik family. We have Alexis, who is in 3rd grade. Alexis, you told me that you were sitting in class this morning and you saw a lot of police. Tell me how you found out what was going on.
Well, we found like there was all these people, and we found out because there was really right near the window in our classroom, and like we saw like police officers and we heard them on the roof and in our building.
Was everybody crying, scared, wanting their parents to come get them?
Yeah, they were, and then some people were even like they kind of wished that they got a stomach ache.
Did you hear any gunshots or anything like that?
Well, police officers, like, they're kinda, because there's police officers, like, right out the door, like, trying to find the guy.
Are you okay right now?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Uh-huh.
All right, how excited were you to see Dad?
I'm excited.
Dad, you look more excited than her, I gotta tell
was.
you.
It was shocking. I got the call at work this morning, and I can't believe a small town like this would ever have anything like this happen. And to be in an elementary school, that's unheard of.
3K through 4?
Yes.
There are about 600 kids in there?
Yes. roughly around 600.
What was going through your mind? I mean, you immediately think of your child.
Yes, I was pretty shaken up. Didn't know, you know, who or what happened. I knew there were shooters in the building or a shooter. Just worried about who else is left in the building at this time.
Mom, what do you think about this scene here in Newtown?
It doesn't even seem real. It just does not seem like it's even possible. It's like you read it in the paper or see it in the news, you're like, oh my God, that poor family. And then you have something happen so close to home. It's like, I think I'm still in shock, to be honest with you. I'm just like, okay, let's go get her cell phone activated right now.
Now, News 8, we have exclusive video from what we've been told of a suspect in cuffs walking away. Does this put you at ease at all?
No, not yet. You know what? We have about 6 choppers flying low. Not yet. I'm not sure if there's more. There's probably more people in the building.
Right. What are other parents saying? Everybody's kind of grouping together and talking and putting each other at ease.
We're coping. We're still trying to find out, you know, what's going on. It's a little nerve-wracking. There's, as you can tell, behind us, we do have a few more cars pulling in at this time. So how many shooters? How many people?
I saw a parent at the bottom of the hill running, crying, wanting to find his kid. Did you have any trouble finding Alexis?
Yeah, I didn't have too much. I was running, obviously, to the school. Somebody told me that the kids were evacuated. Most of the kids were evacuated into the local firehouse here. Inside the firehouse, it was really obviously tough to find because it was packed. But she was there, and we're grateful.
Yeah, again, it's probably a more nerve-wracking scene for a parent, Keith, than the kids at this point. They were there. They're safe now. But every single parent that I've spoken to, and there's a million of them, are just shaken up and want answers immediately. And of course, News 8 will be here live for all the day until we have some answers for you. I'll send it back.
False flag operations are covert operations designed to deceive the public in order to make an attack look like some outside force carried it out. This gives a nation the ability to start a war and make it look like they were the victims. This is very important if the public does not want war, and it also limits the ability for opposing interests to stop the new war. Any opposition, foreign or domestic, would immediately be put in the same category as those that they claim did the false flag.
You're either with us or you're with the enemy.
False flags do not happen very often, but when they do, they change the paradigm we operate in. We all see how the world has been changed forever after 9/11. Before 9/11, we would not have put up with such a loss of privacy and a loss of liberty, much less a decade of war looking for weapons of mass destruction or men in caves.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here.
With the supposed death of Osama bin Laden and the supposed end of military actions in Iraq, I feel the decks are cleared for the next big event. Historically, false flags are military in nature, but I feel going forward they will morph into something much worse. Every system built on debt needs constant debt to be created, or the system implodes. If the criminal elite can expand the debt system through asset bubbles, then all is well. But what happens if they can't get more debt created? They need to either steal other assets to provide capital for the system, or they need a reason to create massive debts that the masses will sacrifice for. Wars do both. With war, the criminal elite can confiscate the natural resources of other nations and provide the context to create massive amount of new debt. Our paradigm is failing, and there is no fixing it. There is so much inequity built into the system at every level. The only answer is for a complete collapse. This collapse will leave a generational scar so large that humanity might never consider again fractional reserve banking or the war machine it enables. Until that collapse, the criminal elite will do what they have always done, create more debt and more wars. The criminal elite see their power paradigm collapsing on its own cancerous self. A silver default, debt ceiling doom, dollar collapse, peak oil, or whatever leads ultimately to the end of the Anglo-American petrodollar financial paradigm. The Anglo-American elite might need to pull off 3 false flags in order to fail forward. This might include the typical military false flag, an economic false flag, and an informational false flag. These dramatic measures will seem necessary to the criminal elite, and the horrific toll on humanity will be justified in their minds. This societal upheaval will be time for the criminal elite to settle all the threats to their power paradigm, much like the end of Godfather 1. The first of the 3 threats to their power is the death of the dollar. The dollar is the basis of all the criminal elite's power. Without it, or an equivalent of it, they have no means to create debt that enslaves nations, states, corporations, and citizens of the world. This debt money provides the criminal elite an unlimited checkbook to fund the world's most powerful military that controls the world's natural resources so that their corporations can harvest them. It also protects the shipping lanes that transports the rest of the world's trade. This debt money also buys political power for which the elite rig the game in their favor. And finally, the criminal elite used their money to own all the major media in order to distract the masses from the real problem in the world, the debt-based banking system, and the paradigm it finances. It is no secret that the dollar is going to die. It is a mathematical inevitability. Nothing can stop the ultimate collapse of the dollar. Our monetary system is based on debt, and in order for it to work, more debt needs to be created every year in excess of the debt and interest accrued the year before. If it does not happen, there will be a massive wave of defaults that would suck the system dry in a few weeks. The elite don't necessarily care if the dollar lives or dies. They just want to control the world's currency. They would ultimately like to have a global international currency that would be far away from pesky national politicians. So if the dollar is doomed, how can the criminal elite fail forward? They can create a financial crisis so incredible that desperate people would beg the elite to make the pain stop. They did this in 1907 to set the stage for the Federal Reserve. They did this in 2008 when they held up America for $700 billion. They will do it again and use the line of stability as the main reason why we should accept their new corrupt plan. I don't think that they could pull off something this large without a much larger distraction to silence the masses. The only thing big enough to scare the masses under the protective hug of the elite is another world war. This war can put an end to another threat of the current world order, the anti-hegemon. Non-Anglo-American nations like China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, among others, have been gaining an incredible amount of power. I call these group of non-Anglo-American powers the anti-hegemon, as they have no uniting ideology, race, or religion, other than standing in opposition to the hegemonic power of the Anglo-American Empire. The anti-hegemon nations have so much to gain from a retreat of the Anglo-American Empire from the world stage. Countries like China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, India, and many more, to a lesser extent like Japan, Korea, Germany, and France, have been on the losing end of the Anglo-American Empire for over a century. These nations have a history of Anglo-American losses like the Cold War, Opium Wars, Operation Ajax, the CIA attempted coup of Chavez, British colonization of India, apartheid, Hiroshima, the closing of the gold window by Nixon, and Waterloo. These are only some of the examples the Anglo-American elite have used in the past to ensure their supremacy. The Anglo-American elite have used every form of deceit to change or cheat the rules in pursuit of world domination. I believe the most likely event for a military false flag will be an American ship sunk in the Strait of Hormuz, supposedly by the Iranians. In order to understand this, it is imperative to understand the petrodollar. After Nixon took the dollar off the international gold standard, the Anglo-American elite devised a way to back the dollar with oil. Without going into too much detail, the plan was simply for their Arab partners to raise the price of oil dramatically and only sell their oil for dollars. They would then recycle all of those dollars back into the Anglo-American financial centers. So if you ever wondered why the Arab nations that called us the Great Satan gave us all their dollars, you now know why. The defense of this petrodollar standard has led us to invade Iraq when Saddam Hussein sold oil for euros, and Gaddafi in Libya when he proposed that he and other nations sell their oil for the new gold dinar. This is also why so many sanctions have been put on to Iran. The Iranians opened up their oil bores in 2008 to sell their oil for anything but the dollar. An attack on an American warship would be exactly what Dick Cheney plotted to do in 2008 before he left office. Here is an insider's account of that meeting from the famed journalist Seymour Hersh.
That a few weeks later, a meeting took place in the vice president's office. Quote, the subject was how to create a casus belli between Tehran and Washington, he said. What you're writing there is that Cheney, there was a meeting in the White House where Cheney presided over, looking to cook up the next war, a false war based on false intelligence.
Among the items considered and rejected, which is why the New Yorker did not publish it on grounds that it wasn't accepted. One of the items was, why not, there was a dozen ideas proffered, how to trigger a war. The one that interested me the most was, why don't we in our shipyard, build 4 or 5 Iranian boats that look like Iranian PT boats, put Navy SEALs on them with a lot of arms, and the next time one of our boats goes through the Straits of Hormuz, start a shoot-up. Might cost some lives, and it was rejected because you can't have Americans killing Americans. But that's the level of stuff we were talking about, provocation.
I don't even think that it necessarily be an American that pulls off this attack on the American ship. If you look at who's been pushing for a war with Iran the most, it is Israel, and the neocons that got us into the last war. They proudly talk about how they get us to fight their wars. Here's a clip of Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu talking about their secret weapon.
But I'll tell you one thing, unlike America, Israel seems to be able to fight wars very quickly. What is your secret? Because we don't seem to have the hang of that.
The secret is that we have America.
Nah.
And America, you see, the point is that Israel...
If you think that that was just a slip, please look into Project for a New American Century or the 1967 USS Liberty incident, where unmarked Israeli planes attacked and nearly sunk the most decorated ship in our fleet with the purpose of getting the United States to attack Egypt.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded.
Girls, delightful in Cuba, stop. Could send you prose poems about scenery, but don't feel right spending your money. Stop. There is no war in Cuba. Signed, Wheeler. Any answer?
Yes, dear Wheeler, you provide the prose poems. I'll provide the war.
That's fine, Mr. King.
Yes, I rather like...
And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure.
There was a dozen ideas proffered how to trigger a war. The one that interested me the most was, why don't we in our shipyard build 4 or 5 Iranian boats that look like Iranian PT boats, put Navy SEALs on them with a lot of arms, and the next time one of our boats goes through the Straits of Hormuz, start a shoot-up.
But I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition. It's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
A false flag attack, like an American ship sunk in the Strait of Hormuz, would also keep Iranian allies like Russia and China at bay, much like the 9/11 attacks kept them from using their power to stop the United States from invading Iraq. The world is a much different place than it was in 2000, and China and Russia have learned a lot, as they have been vocal opponents of many of the pressures the Anglo-American empire has applied to Iran. If China does rise in opposition, that would be something the Anglo-Americans could easily turn the American public onto them too. Our horrible economic conditions are directly responsible to those that own and control our paradigm, the criminal elite in Washington and Wall Street. That being said, the criminal elite will blame all of the problems on anything else in the world except for them. China could have purposely been made into a threat only to take them down in the future. Let me first state that I am no fan of China. Their elite have human rights violations against their own citizens that would make you sick to your stomach. But let's be honest, China would not be a threat if our criminal elite did not build them up in the first place. Our military-industrial complex needs an enemy to justify their war machine. The war on terror was a good ride, but after almost a decade, it's getting a little old. Our banking system needed another country to buy our paper Ponzi scheme, and China became the most obvious target after Japan gorged itself on our debt. Our elites made deals with the Chinese elites to move our manufacturing overseas to use their slave labor and pollute their environment. The Chinese communists got all the technology and manufacturing and dollars to build up China as a threat. Our elite did this to make tremendous profits and keep the dollar paradigm going. But in the end, I believe that our criminal elite may use China to be the next enemy in a paradigm-shifting war. Since China has now said no more American debt, the Federal Reserve has stepped up as the buyer of last resort. This has bought us some time, but there's a huge economic difference of recycling dollars already in circulation, like the Chinese dollars, than freshly printed ones like that from the Federal Reserve. The Anglo-American elite must solve Triffin's dilemma, where a world currency reaches its apex and must be allowed to default, but somehow not drag down the rest of the world with it. The elite have been trying to get regional and ultimately global currencies in place to solve this dilemma. Now, no nation is going to give up their power to create money, especially now that we're looking at the euro imploding. The only option, I feel, is to do it the old-fashioned way, through war. The only thing the United States is really good at now is exporting debt and bombs. There is way too much at stake for our elite to just silently walk away into the night without a fight. They are trying to keep things going by now fighting 4, 5, 6 wars in the oil-rich Middle East and North Africa region. But the writing is on the wall. The debt ceiling will continue to be raised, and money and debt will be created, and the war machine will continue to churn. This will not end because the elite will say, we can't do this anymore. If anything, history has shown that when the chips are down on the table, they will double down and go off to war. The destruction of the dollar will either be the cause of war, or war will be the destruction of the dollar. If there is an economic false flag, like a massive treasury sell-off, then it could be a cause of war with China. Or if there is a military false flag, it will cause the dollar's destruction and force introduction of a new monetary paradigm, possibly a global currency. The elite will use this upheaval to destroy any competitors. In the smoking aftermath of the war, they will impose a new paradigm based off of the same destructive seeds of the old paradigm. There is a third threat to the elite's power paradigm that can and should stop all of this. Freedom of information. There is no doubt the internet has gotten away from the criminal elite and that their lies have been exposed. Small sites all over the internet have shown over and over again that the emperor has no clothes. I can see an informational false flag to coincide with the economic and military false flag. They can falsely blame China or domestic groups like Anonymous for massive internet shutdowns. I believe that big corporations will still have a functioning internet, but small informational sites will be shut down for sake of quote-unquote national security. Perhaps it could even be something much worse, where they shut down all free speech and opposition for the sake of national security. I believe ultimately a wide-awake humanity will put an end to all these forms of treachery. We have the benefit of seeing the same playbook over and over again throughout history, and if they do try another false flag, it is imperative that we question the perceived reality and wake humanity up before we get marched off to another war. Our job is not necessarily to fight this evil. We only need to expose evil so it'll cease to have power. The real challenge is to show people that the good that they think they are doing is really evil, and they will no longer do it. We need to convince our fellow citizens that debt and war are evil, and we need to rid this scourge from humanity once and for all. The timing and order of all this is unknown, but just know that it's going to get dramatically worse before it gets any better. Every 80 years or so, a paradigm dies and a new one is born out of the ashes of the old. 80 years ago, we had the Great Depression and World War II, and this was the creation of our current paradigm. 80 years before that, we had the Civil War, and 80 years before that, we had the Revolutionary War. So far, the United States has survived and has gone on to become a global superpower. This time around, we have the possibility of a revolutionary war, a civil war, or a world war, or a combination of all three. There is nothing in writing that says America will go on forever. In fact, given our horrible record on debt and war, this system deserves to die an awful death, so that humanity will never go back down this path again. Only then can we go about creating a new paradigm, one that resonates with who we are, built upon peace and understanding.
Want to know what's going on? Want to get the inside scoop? Minutemen Radio, the Mark Fluid broadcast, will give you the stories that corporate media mongers will not tell you. Want the truth? Then go to fluidnews.webs.com. That's fluidnews.webs.com. Now you can get good quality made gifts from true veterans. No more will you have to keep shelling out your money to the fat corporate mongers that all they do is can keep you down. The globalists want you to spend all your hard-earned money, but why would you, when you can go to the top Patriot stores around, and one of them are FEShopworld.webs.com, a complete line of military local gifts designed by 100% American. Stop catering to the globalists, and stop catering to a crisis. Make a difference today. Go to FEShopworld.webs.com.
In hopes of avoiding a government shutdown, lawmakers in the House have approved a 6-month spending bill that will fund the government through the end of the year. The measure passed 267 to 151, with most Republicans supporting it and Democrats voting it down. Some experts say that's no surprise.
It's something that's always been with us to some extent, but it's far worse now. There is no common political culture in the United States. We have one half of the population that gets all of its news from MSNBC and listens to certain talking heads on the left, and the other half that watches Fox News and listens to certain talking heads on the right.
The proposed stopgap measure provides nearly $1 trillion in funding, enough to keep government agencies running beyond April of this year when current funding will expire. But the latest voting conflict adds complexity to the fiscal crisis that Washington seems subject to lately. The partisan divide, demonstrating to be the biggest threat to sustainable budgeting on the Hill.
They have nothing in common in terms of values or goals. So it's not even a question of coming to the middle or compromising on something. They don't even want to achieve the same things. So what is there to compromise on?
With the government shutdown still a possibility, President Obama is expressing optimism that a fresh round of talks could break the obstacles of the fiscal impasse. Experts say there needs to be a desire for both sides to reach an agreement, but skepticism is becoming a prevailing attitude.
I'm encouraged by the president's outreach. I hope it bears fruit, but I know this, if we never talk to each other, I know exactly what's going to happen. This country is going to fail.
If a government shutdown occurs, not only could the U.S.'s credit rating be downgraded as it has been in the past, but the president would be blamed for his failed leadership and the U.S. economic recovery would all but certainly fall flat. President Obama hosted a dinner at a local restaurant here in Washington, D.C. He invited top lawmakers to work on a resolution. The president then picked up the tab and opposition leaders emerged optimistic. But it's yet to be determined if that initial compromise will translate into congressional votes to fix the budget. Colin Campbell, Press TV, Washington.
Citizens of the Internet,
Last year we faced our greatest threat from lawmakers. We faced down SOPA, PIPA, CISPA and ACTA. And we won. But that victory did not come easily. Nor did it come without a price. Aaron Swartz was one of the leading voices in the fight against these idiotic and destructive efforts to control the last free space on Earth. Aaron Swartz was persecuted. Now Aaron Swartz is dead. Tonight, the President of the United States will appear before a joint session of Congress to deliver the State of the Union address, and tomorrow he plans to sign an executive order for cybersecurity as the House Intelligence Committee reintroduces the defeated CISPA Act, which turns private companies into government informants. He will not be covering the NDAA, an act of outright tyrannical legislation allowing for indefinite detention of citizens completely outside due process and the rule of law. In fact, lawyers for the government have point-blank refused to state whether or not journalists who cover stories or groups the government disfavors would be subject to this detention. He will not be covering the extrajudicial and unregulated justifications for targeted killings of citizens by military drones within the borders of America, or the fact that Orwellian newspeak had to be used to make words like imminent mean their opposite. He will not be covering Bradley Manning, 1,000 days in detention with no trial for revealing military murders, told that his motive for leaking cannot be taken into consideration, that the government does not have room for conscience. He will not be covering the secret interpretations of law that allow for warrantless wiretapping and surveillance of any U.S. citizen without probable cause of criminal acts, or the use of catch-22 logic where no one can complain about being snooped on because the state won't tell you who they're snooping on. And if you don't know you're being snooped on, you don't have a right to complain. We reject the State of the Union. We reject the authority of the President to sign arbitrary orders and bring irresponsible and damaging controls to the Internet. The President of the United States of America and the joint session of Congress will face an army tonight. We will form a virtual blockade between Capitol Hill and the Internet. Armed with nothing more than lulls, Nyan Cat and pew-pew-pew lasers, we will face down the largest superpower on Earth, and we will win. There will be no State of the Union address on the web tonight. For freedom, for Aaron Swartz, for the Internet, and of course, for the lulls. We are anonymous, we are legion. We do not forgive, we do not forget. Expect us.
Want to know what's going on? Want to get the inside scoop? Minutemen Radio, the Mark Fluid broadcast, will give you the stories that corporate media mongers will not tell you. Want the truth? Then go to fluidnews.webs.com. That's fluidnews.webs.com. Now you can get good quality made gifts from true veterans. No more will you have to keep shelling out your money to the fat corporate mongers that all they do is can keep you down. The globalists want you to spend all your hard-earned money, but why would you when you can go to the top Patriot stores around, and one of them are effyshopworld.webs.com, a complete line of military local gifts designed by 100% American. Stop catering to the globalists and stop catering to a crisis. Make a difference today. Go to effyshopworld.webs.com.